In the last class, we looked at some of the tendencies that can be barriers to producing fruit. And then in this class, we're going to focus more on some of the tendencies that can be beneficial to our spiritual soil and help us produce fruit. The most important component that will determine whether we produce fruit or not is whether we are abiding in God and Jesus. Let's read 1 John 2, verse 24. 1 John 2, verse 24. As for you, let that abide in you which you heard from the beginning. If what you heard from the beginning abides in you, you also will abide in the Son and in the Father. The word abide literally means to stay. Strong's adds the words continue, dwell, endure, be present. One commentary added that this has to do with an energy that is continually operating in someone. This concept starts in the Old Testament, and we're going to read Psalm 91. Psalm 91, I'm going to read the whole thing. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. For it is he who delivers you from the snare of the trapper and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you may seek refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and bulwark. You will not be afraid of the terror by night, or of the arrow that flies by day, of the pestilence that stalks in darkness, or of the destruction that lays waste at noon. 1,000 may fall at your side and 10,000 at your right hand, but it shall not approach you. You will only look on with your eyes and see the recompense of the wicked. For you have made the Lord my refuge, even the Most High, your dwelling place. No evil will befall you, nor will any plague come near your tent. For he will give his angels charge concerning you to guard you in all your ways. They will bear you up in their hands, that you do not strike your foot against a stone. You will tread upon the lion and the cobra, the young lion and the serpent you will trample down. Because he has loved me, therefore I will deliver him. I will set him securely on high, because he has known my name. He will call upon me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will rescue him and honor him. With a long life I will satisfy him and let him see my salvation. I think this is such a soothing psalm. Listen to the words that indicate protection, shelter, shadow of the Almighty, refuge, fortress, trust. It talks about being delivered, being covered with God's wings. His faithfulness is a shield. It talks about not needing to be afraid, making the Lord our refuge, our dwelling place. His angels keeping watch over you, guarding you, calling and God answering. God being with you in trouble, rescuing you, offering long life and ultimately salvation. This psalm offers hope for this life, but ultimately it's pointing toward the kingdom. It urges us to have an eternal perspective, knowing that we are safe, we are eternally safe with God, no matter what happens in this life. Now let's go back to John 15, which we read last night. Did we read it? Yeah, I think we read it. We read it at some point, maybe this morning. Jesus links it all together, abiding in God as the vine dresser, the gardener tending the soil, and Jesus as the vine. Verse 4, you cannot bear fruit unless you abide in me. Staying attached to the vine is the message. How do we do this from a practical standpoint? Let's just take a couple minutes and do another, actually just maybe share out loud. We'll, instead of getting in our groups, just anyone have any thoughts on that? We'll just have 2 or 3 comments, just a couple sentences. How do we abide in the vine practically? Praying for God to open your heart to his will. What else?
Reading the scriptures.
Reading the scriptures. Meditating.
Fellowshipping.
Fellowshipping. Lots of ing. Memorizing. Memorizing scripture.
Visualizing your physical interaction with Jesus.
Visualizing your physical interaction
interaction
with Jesus. Nice. Janine?
Being in your own body so that you know what's going on.
Being in your own body so you know what's going on and where you're disconnected. Yeah, and a lot of these are feeding into things we're going to hit more on a little bit later. Betty, did you have your hand?
I was just going to say, this living, trying to live, what you read and meditate on.
Living what you read and you meditate on. Yeah. I had some things, y'all hit most of them. Being present, prayer, meditation, listening and not just talking in our prayer and our meditation, reading the word, being in community with others, following the way that Jesus lays out for us to live our lives, cultivating the soil and bearing fruit. They're all, yeah, it's all contingent on staying attached to the vine.
Can I add one more?
Yes.
Discovering if you have your own attachment issue as a child. It greatly affects your attachment issue.
Yeah, that's so important. Your ability to attach to your Father. Okay. Thank you. Let's go back to that list of tendencies. Again, I feel like it's not exactly the word that I'm really looking for, but y'all are smart people. Okay, so these are qualities, tendencies, characteristics, behaviors that we want to allow God to cultivate in our lives through walking in his spirit and through the atoning work and the living presence of Jesus. The rest of this class is going to be an overview of some ways to increase some of these things in our lives. And because it's an overview, it's probably going to feel like we're just barely scratching the surface, and there's really just no way around that. So we talked about abiding. Now let's talk about boundaries. And this touches a lot of the other things we talked about, touch on boundaries. Boundary is a separation between one or more things. Our skin is a boundary between us and the outside world. If we didn't have it, we would die. But we can often struggle with boundaries, especially if proper boundaries haven't been modeled for us. So some unhealthy boundaries in general may look like letting people cross lines that they shouldn't, or us crossing lines that we shouldn't. Examples of some unhealthy boundaries include not expressing opinions that we don't think others will agree with, going along with activities that may go against your values, letting others decide your career or make other big life decisions for you, oversharing about a situation or talking too intimately about to someone you barely know or about something, giving too much or not at all, expecting others to anticipate your needs without you expressing them, or the opposite, expecting yourself to know the needs of others when they haven't expressed them. And that can go back to that hypervigilance we talked about. where you think that your safety, or where maybe your safety has been contingent on being able to read the temperature of people around you and adapt accordingly. Touching someone without permission, trusting everyone or trusting no one. And then some examples of healthy boundaries include taking responsibility, and these are the opposites of a lot of those. Taking responsibility for our own actions and emotions while still communicating and the impact others have on us, because we do impact each other. And we're responsible for our emotions, but it doesn't mean that we can't hurt other people. Maintaining our values despite others' opinions and actions. Making decisions for ourselves about our careers and our lives. Deciding if a relationship is wanted and is appropriate before rushing to get involved with someone. Saying no when you don't want something or don't want to do something. Accepting when others say no. Sharing details that are appropriate to the situation and to the level of relationship you have with someone. Expressing when someone has violated a boundary and what the consequence will be. Because remember that we can only control our actions. We cannot demand that someone respect our boundaries, but we can enforce our boundaries. And apologizing when you have intentionally or unintentionally violated a boundary. Ultimately, boundaries are about knowing that I am me and you are you, and that's how God designed us. We're interdependent as parts of a body, and we should consider how our actions affect each other. But this concept, taken too far, leads to us not recognizing the autonomy and the responsibility that God has given each one of us. If God wanted me to be just like you, he would not have made both of us. So we will have differences of opinion, and Romans 12 talks about there are many members and different gifts. We're not always the same. Let's turn to that. Romans 12, verses 3 through 8. Romans 12, I'm actually going to start at verse 4. For just as we have many members in one body, and all members do not have the same function, so we who are many are one body in Christ, and individually members one of another. Since we have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, notice it's given to us. It's that gift of God. Each of us is to exercise them accordingly. If prophecy, according to the proportion of his faith, if service in his serving, or he who teaches in his teaching, or he who exhorts in his exhortation, he who gives with liberality, he who leads with diligence, he who shows mercy with cheerfulness. Having unhealthy boundaries is often a response to trauma, which we talked a little bit about earlier, or not having a secure attachment style, which Kim mentioned. When we have blurred boundaries, it's often a conscious or unconscious attempt to keep ourselves safe, loved, and accepted. And those are three things that we get from God, and that in an ideal situation, we get and give to those around us: being safe, being loved, and being accepted. It takes time to learn how to readjust boundaries once we see the need. And if you haven't read the book Boundaries, it's called Boundaries, by Cloud and Townsend, I haven't read it in years, but it's a good book, and they actually have several really helpful personal growth books. So that's a good starting place if this is a new concept for you, or a concept you recognize some need for cultivation in. It's also important to recognize that you won't always get that balance right, and neither will the people you interact with. If you know someone who struggles with enforcing their boundaries, encourage them to tell you no when they mean no, and to exercise their autonomy. Give yourself and others grace and compassion to find their proper boundaries. Let's see. not quite ready for that. We can see how some of those thorns and rocks and things we talked about earlier, like people pleasing and perfectionism, the need for control, we can see how those can be heavily impacted by not having proper boundaries and not respecting others' boundaries. We talked about how a fruit tree doesn't produce fruit in every season and doesn't produce the same amount of fruit every year. As women, I think we often struggle to say no. When we talked about this a little earlier, this can be an issue in an ecclesial setting where sisters' roles are often very focused on busyness and service. We can feel like our worth is determined by how much we say yes to and what we say yes to. But what does our worth come from? Y'all can answer that.
Our Father.
Yeah, our Father, our identity as children of God, as brothers of Christ. So we need to make a conscious effort not to put this pressure to perform on ourselves or each other. Again, going back to something we talked about earlier, because I think this is something we all can, does this seem relevant? The idea of saying yes, not, struggling with when to say no sometimes. Excuse me. How many times have you been asked to take on an aspect of service, or maybe you weren't asked, maybe you just felt that pressure from within when you know you don't have the time or the mental bandwidth? And what did you say? Have you ever had the thought that if I don't say yes, they'll think I'm lazy, or questioned your worthiness based on whether you've taken enough food to potluck? We all have to self-examine on this, because we can easily fall into times of idleness and apathy, and that's not, we don't want to go, we want to stay balanced. We don't want to be that pendulum that goes from one extreme to another, which is in itself a trauma response often. So we don't want to fall into idleness and apathy. We need to be on guard against that. But it's equally problematic to be addicted to chronic busyness in the Lord, sometimes at the expense of our self-care or our family. So let's normalize trusting ourselves and trusting each other to know when we need to step up and when we need to step back.
I also appreciate sometimes when you say, it's okay to say no.
Yes, no is a full sentence. I wasn't really expecting that to be funny, but I recently heard a phrase that I've been practicing. Actually, let's all say this together. The phrase is, my plate is as full as I'd like it right now.
My plate is as full as I like it right now.
Thank you. It feels so different than saying, I'm overbooked, I'm way too busy. Those things imply that you're not in control, and you may feel out of control about what you've taken on, but saying, my plate is as full as I'd like it. It shows that I'm responsible for what I take on, and it subtly communicates that I don't have to be too busy in order to say no to something. Another sentence I like is, I'm not going to be able to take that on. We often feel like we have to give a specific reason, and sometimes it does feel weird to, can you do this? No. That's just, there's ways of saying it that are more or less, diplomatic. But let's make each other feel comfortable saying, no, I don't know, whatever. I try not to say I'm sorry, because you also don't have to be sorry. You can just decline. So we don't have to offer long explanations, although again, it feels very uncomfortable not to. You are enough. Your worth is not determined by your busyness. We want our yeses to flow from a place of love and joy and willingness and self-regulation, not from guilt, shame, or fear of others, or fear of sitting still with ourselves. Insert a cough drop. 'Cause Okay, so this I think is a nice bridge to talking about our ability to regulate our nervous systems, which is so vital to this cultivation of our soil. And I've really struggled. I've talked with several of you about how to take such a huge concept and make it relevant and practical, and not just skimming the surface so little that it's not helpful, but also not trying to go so in depth that we're here till tomorrow. So it is what it is, and that's okay. So our nervous system is the communication system for our bodies. It sends electrical signals between our brains, our spinal cords, and the rest of our bodies. And it plays a key role in regulating our movements, our thoughts, sensations, emotions, basically everything. I mean, we're just made up of nerves. Nervous system dysregulation occurs when this system isn't working at its optimal level. Symptoms of dysregulation can include feeling chronically stressed, having digestive issues, headaches, migraines, anxiety, difficulty concentrating. I wrote anxiety twice. That's a big one for most people. Depression, hypervigilance, panic attacks, or other physical or mental illnesses. I liked this thing that I saw the other day. It says, "Sorry for the late response. It's just that we were never meant to live so fast." Oh, I also remembered in the middle of the night, I found a meme, but I didn't put it on here, but it was a little opossum. And he said, "I don't have a nervous system. I am a nervous system." There you go. You get the verbal description. So God has built-in tools. Let me see if we need this. We'll get to that in a second. You can enjoy this little mouse. I heard different ones. Rabbit. Okay. What would I do without y'all? So God has built-in tools for us to regulate our nervous systems with Him, with ourselves, with each other. But we live in a world, like this says, we were never meant to live so fast. We live in a world that constantly challenges this ability to regulate. In an ideal world, we would all be born into a loving family. And as an infant, our needs, and many of us are, our needs as an infant would be met by loving and responsive caregivers. We would be soothed by our parents, who would themselves have well-regulated nervous systems. And over time, we would learn to self-soothe. We would learn how to handle small challenges, being hungry, being dirty, sleepy, otherwise discontent. We would adapt to these challenges, never having to face more than we were ready to handle. As we grew up, we would have plenty of sunlight, fresh air, exercise, healthy food, lots of phytochemicals and all that stuff, intergenerational relationships, and healthy spiritual practices. When something stressful happened, we would temporarily go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. And then after the event passed, our lifestyle would be conducive to going back into a state of rest and relaxation. That's that regulation process. We get activated and then we calm down. Some of you are very calm right now after lunch, I can see. We would easily self-regulate, and we would also co-regulate through physical and emotional contact with other well-regulated loved ones and with God and Jesus. One of my favorite things to do is pick up one of my dogs and say, "Oh, co-regulating," because we can regulate with all mammals. I think is it just mammals that have nervous systems? I think. Anyway, different note. So we live in a world that our ancestors and those in biblical times could not have imagined. We have access to amounts of information and stimuli that our brains and bodies struggle to cope with. We have screen pollution, light pollution, traffic, the stress of too much money often, and we might have the stress of too little money as well. Unhealthy food, we sit too much, we ingest too many chemicals. Does this make you anxious just hearing it? But that's our life. Our nervous systems are overloaded, and many of us live in constant dysregulated states of fight, flight, freeze, or collapse or shut down. This manifests in anxiety, depression, mental and physical illness, spiritual illness. It impacts our interactions with ourselves, with others, and with God. Almost all of those thorns in our soil that we talked about earlier can stem from this dysregulation. So what can we do about it? Again, a huge topic, and we can't even scratch this. So let's take a few moments and imagine ourselves living in biblical times. God has built a lot of nervous system regulation into his word in various places. And adopting as many of these practices as possible is a great place to start. Imagine living, might have already said that. Imagine living in biblical times. You would have walked almost everywhere you went. Walking increases circulation, and it has a positive influence on what's called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, or HPA axis. This impacts your stress response positively. It helps reduce cortisol, which is your stress hormone. You often would have walked barefoot, which puts you in contact with the earth and the electrical impulses coming out of the earth. This grounding activity can help improve sleep, reduce inflammation. And when you walk, I just saw this, maybe one of you may have mentioned this actually. When you walk, you naturally look from side to side. And that stimulates your vagus nerve and has a calming effect. The vagus nerve is an important part of the nervous system. It runs from your brain to your large intestine. And this connects your brain to your gut. And among other things, this is why, among other reasons, this is why we can feel anxiety in our gut. So your worship in biblical times, your worship would include practices that stimulate this vagus nerve, such as lifting your eyes, raising your hands, singing, chanting, praying out loud, swaying, crying, mourning. The practice of gratitude naturally increases oxytocin, which is the love hormone. Singing as well. And cortisol, the hormone we produce when we're stressed or fearful, is cast out by oxytocin. Perfect love casts out fear. Oxytocin casts out cortisol. Of course, God knew that because God designed that. You would have 1 day a week of rest, and you would have regular practices of prayer and meditation. Offerings and sacrifices, all of this physical sensory experience, incense, as well as ritual cleansing, other practices under the law, would have had powerful effects on self-regulation and co-regulating as a group. Repentance, confession, fasting, feet washing, water baptism, anointing with oil, practicing forgiveness, solitude, celebration. These are all things that would have helped you regulate. The isolation of women during their menstruation, we read it like it's a bad thing, that they're unclean and they're, kind of put off in the tent. Who wouldn't love that? You go out in the tent and you weave a basket. The husband is taking care of the babies.
All your friends would be having their cycles.
Yeah.
Because that's what women do. So you see everyone, all your friends.
Yeah. We should bring that back. So times of out there with other women laughing, crying, resting, what a blessing, and a time of regulation. And God, there's nothing in God's law that is meant to be oppressive. It's all liberating, and there's beauty in that. You would have spent time learning oral history and stories and memorizing and remembering. There's so much regulation in remembering the past positively. These all have positive effects on our nervous system. Many of these things we still have access to, but we have to cultivate them in our lives. Self-regulation does not happen by accident anymore. And we don't follow the design that God laid out long, long ago as closely as they did. So we're not getting these things on a day-to-day basis. We have to live intentionally. In the time we have left, I want to talk about a few things we can do to incorporate some of these good nervous system practices into our lives. This will involve a lot of those other tendencies that we've discussed. So if you're willing, I'd like us to do a visualization together, exercise together, using Psalm 1. Sorry, don't turn to it. Because I'm going to ask you to close your eyes if you're willing. If you're not willing, I can't control what you do. So I want you to use your senses to experience the imagery. Close your eyes if you feel comfortable and breathe deeply down to your diaphragm. And remember, we breathe backwards as adults. Babies get it right. They puff their belly out when they inhale. And then when they exhale, that's when we should pull it in. We often breathe just in our shoulders and so just try to feel it down to your diaphragm. Okay. Okay, Psalm 1. So let's just focus on all your senses. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, which giveth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also will not wither, and whatsoever he doeth will prosper. The ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind driveth away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the seat in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. So let's try to keep breathing deeply and focus on the power of these sensory experiences that God builds into his word. Mindfulness. Simply put, mindfulness is paying attention to one thing at a time on purpose. If you're washing dishes, you're focusing on the warmth of the water, the texture of the suds, the sound of the sponge scraping. If you're taking a walk, you're using your senses to be in the present, focusing on the sights, the sounds, and the smells. There's an exercise called 5 Things, where you just go through your senses one at a time. And those of you who have been in various ladies' classes here, we've talked about this a lot. So you start with 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. Another thing I'll often do is just pick one object to examine using all my senses. You can do this with anything. You can pick whatever you have right there. So how does it feel? What's the temperature of it? The texture? Does it make any kind of sound? Does it have a smell? Does it have a color? Are there patterns? Does it have a flavor or taste? These are just simple ways of being present. I heard a cool quote the other day. It said, "God is ever present. Are we?" God, through his Spirit, is right here with us all the time. Can we spend more time being right here, abiding, dwelling in that presence, dwelling in the present? Mindfulness often involves noticing your thoughts without judging or trying to change them, but then intentionally shifting to something in the present rather than in the past or in the future. Speaking of thoughts, a lot of those thorns and rocks that we discussed have to do with how we think of ourselves and others. 2 Corinthians 10, verse 5 says, "We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ." I think we often quote this quite out of context, because I think it's talking about more ways of thinking, philosophies, rather than our individual thoughts. But I think there's a helpful element that we can apply. We do need to take our thoughts captive in a sense, but this isn't by obsessing over them and trying to wrestle them out of our head. Our influence over our thoughts comes slowly, little by little, and often counterintuitively. What I mean by this is we don't often have we do, okay. What I mean by this is that often we have to accept our thoughts as they are before we can subtly start shifting them. We know that we can't stop thinking something by telling ourselves to. I mean, we all know that don't think of a blue elephant. Like you can't tell yourself what not to think. In fact, that's how we give our thoughts more power. But when we accept a thought as it is, and accepting in this case is not about, has no moral, we're not saying I approve of this thought, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about accepting that the thought is what it is in this moment. And what it is just a thought. And once we accept that thought as it is, we can start to think less of our thoughts and start influencing them more. Yes.
Often those thoughts stem because they were not seen or heard by significant people in our lives. And so the avoidance of that, like once you see and hear that thought, it will put itself to bed.
That's a good point. She said often those thoughts come about because they weren't seen or heard or validated, maybe I'll add, or acknowledged. And once you do that, you can often put that thought to bed. Yeah, really good point. And one way to influence our thoughts is by reframing them non-judgmentally. I have OCD in remission. And a huge part of the struggle of OCD is giving too much power to a thought and then taking steps to try to neutralize it. So the classic example, which isn't my struggle, but I have this thought that I'm going to catch Ebola. So I go wash my hands 5,000 times. And then the compulsive behavior reinforces the obsessive thought and makes it stronger next time. So there's no winning in that situation. Once you realize that performing whatever neutralizing ritual we do in our head with our thoughts, once we realize that that neutralizing ritual actually is reinforcing the obsessive thought, you can start to reprogram that. And a lot of times that is just sitting with the thought, letting it be there, letting it, some of you probably heard the leaves on a stream, letting it just float by. One important skill in taking thoughts captive is the ability to reframe our thoughts when needed. This can be through simple practices such as not identifying ourselves as our emotions or thoughts. When you think, I am mad, or I am a bad piano player, these words send subtle messages to your brain. We can insert a little distance just by saying things like, I am feeling mad, or I feel mad. I am experiencing anger. I'm having the thought that I'm a bad piano player. And it sounds simplistic, but I do think it's really powerful. It's a step, it's removing us just one step from identifying with that thought as our concept of who we are. And it can be powerful in helping us recognize that we are not just our thoughts or our emotions. We are a child of God with certain personality traits, habits, thought patterns, emotional patterns, behavioral patterns. We can choose and change many of these things with effort and intention, and again, abiding. And we can do it even more effectively when we come from a place of, can you fill in a blank? Something we talked about earlier. Love, that's a good one. Compassion, self-compassion. Yeah, all these things. Kindness. And not guilt or shame. Let's try a simple exercise. We're going to call it notice, name, and reframe. And I put it in quotes. I don't think I came up with this, but I don't know exactly where this phrase came from. And I Googled it and didn't find it. So maybe I did come up with it. But the concept is not mine. So imagine a scenario in which you typically would feel negative feelings and thoughts about yourself. Maybe it's a habit you fall into that you don't like. Perhaps you tend to be chronically late. You make sloppy mistakes at work. Maybe you get angry and lash out easily. So does everyone have your scenario? This is like your go-to, I'm a horrible person because blank. So whenever that happens, what kinds of thoughts and feelings and sensations might you have? Just call those out. What are all those negative feelings you're feeling when you think that? Frustration, shame, guilt, regret, embarrassment. I'm stupid, I can't change. So when we notice, name, and reframe, we simply observe that thought or feeling or sensation and give it a name. So sometimes what we notice first is a feeling in our body, a sensation. My stomach feels upset, my shoulders feel tense. I notice that I'm feeling angry at myself for making this mistake again. Yes. Yeah, I feel that right now. Yeah. Yeah, Janine said, just an overall kind of, where your nervous system is just firing off. It's not exactly what you said, but. So, yeah, and we might think, so we want to name it. We might think I'm having the thought that I made the same mistake again and I'll never be able to change. I notice that my stomach feels upset. My shoulders feel tense. Kim, I think it was this morning, Kim and I were listening to something that said, when you're wearing your shoulders as earrings, that's a problem. I tend to do it just with my left shoulder. Just feel like, yeah. So we've noticed it, we've named it, and now let's reframe it. This can be done in several ways. So maybe we need to tell ourselves a different story, literally. Tell yourself a story. Once upon a time, there was a girl named Mandy. She's working on being more prompt. This doesn't apply to Mandy, but when she's on time, she feels a sense of accomplishment. So we all have stories we tell ourselves in our heads all the time. They used to call a lot of this stuff, they would call it old tapes or old programming, or it's funny, the old tapes thing, because we don't really have tapes anymore. Old iTunes, I don't know, yeah. Even CDs are obsolete. So we all have these stories and we're telling them to ourselves all day. We might as well make them positive, helpful stories. Another way to reframe is to remind ourselves of the objective reality. So we notice, we name the feelings, the emotions, the sensations of being late, for instance. Then we reframe and we just say, I was 10 minutes late. It's just objective. We can say, I don't like how that felt. A lot of times we can think, but did anyone really notice? No one really noticed, no one really cared. Or maybe they did. Maybe someone got annoyed. And in that case, it doesn't have to, we don't have to go from here to someone was annoyed. It's, someone was annoyed that I was late again. So I apologized and I'm going to try to be on time next time. Just trying to take a step back, like zoom out, look at the big picture. And then we can use those mindfulness techniques that we talked about and we're going to keep talking about to stay in the present and to not let our mind I shouldn't say not let our mind keep going back, because we really have very little control over whether our mind goes to something else, but we can keep shifting back to the present. Yeah, mindfulness, present moment awareness. These are good antidotes for shame and rumination. Okay. Romans 12:2 says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. And again, this could be a whole series of classes just on this verse. I believe a lot of this transformation and renewal happens in ways that we don't fully understand. It's God working in us, Christ working in us. But we were given a role. We are co-creators. We help transform and renew our minds by observing and working with our thoughts and patterns of behavior, noticing what we need to change, and continuing to seek methods for doing this. If one method doesn't work, keep trying. You have the rest of your life to figure it out. Let's talk more about emotions. So emotions are energy in motion. They have to go somewhere. We naturally how do we express happiness? If you're feeling happy or joyful, or picture a little kid, yeah, I'm seeing movement, right? Hands in the air, maybe dancing, singing, squealing, shaking, whatever, jumping up and down. We hug, we dance, we move. And we kind of do that naturally with happiness or joy, or a lot of us do. But other emotions have to be expressed too. They have to move and be processed through and out of our bodies, or they can get stuck and become illness, including physical, spiritual, mental illness. And this is this is quickly going from theories that people have had to now established scientific fact. Emotions, a lot of you have probably heard of the body keeps the score, and all this stuff lives inside us. So I tried to come up with a little phrase for this to make it easy to remember. So are you ready? It's brilliant. Okay, so it is, don't suppress or go to excess, but express and process.
Brilliant.
That was so validating. Thank you. But okay, I'm going to say it again. Don't suppress. You don't have to ooh again, but I'm just going to say it. Don't suppress or go to excess, but express and process. Okay. Suppressing emotion isn't helpful, or repressing, you might say. It's another one I could add. That becomes illness, especially things like anger and but going to excess isn't helpful either. Raging when you're angry, that is really bad for your heart. That also causes illness. But expressing both in words and actions is vital. So this might mean telling someone how you feel, journaling, praying, some other form of expression. I would caution slightly against just expressing and expressing and expressing. Like we all, we know what that feels like, where you're just like, ugh, just spewing it. That's not helpful. That's excess. So expressing it, simply getting it out. and then physically processing in some way. For instance, anger can be processed through pressure. One thing I'll do, sometimes I'll push on a wall or squeeze my hands together. You have to be careful if you have any kind of, shoulder issue or whatever. Jumping jacks. I have a little trampoline, a little rebounder. Janine,
Sorry. No, no.
go for it.
With anger specifically, it's often stored in the upper body, which is why people like sometimes if they get really angry, they'll like punch a wall or hopefully not a person. But so a healthy way to express anger physiologically, because it's one of the ones that we have to be really careful not to just like say to people,
Mm-hmm.
and is to in the privacy of your own home, like punch a pillow or like just let it out through your upper body or exercise, focusing on your upper body, get processing.
Yeah, good point. So anger often stored in your upper body, so processing it. And interestingly, I was going to say that I personally, I don't find it helpful to punch a pillow or scream or, but I think that's also because that's not something I would ever really naturally do. I do have a punching bag that I use for exercise, and I do sometimes find that helpful. But I definitely, that concept of vigorous exercise or something that lets out a burst of energy can really help process it. Another thing, and this can help with a lot of different emotions, singing loudly, something that kind of mimics the natural, like you want to punch someone in the face. Well, what mimics that? And so it might be punching a pillow or punching a punching bag. It might be just pressure of some kind, hugging yourself, hugging someone else. But often like singing loudly, because you kind of want to scream, but try just singing at the top of your lungs, which is also kind of weird, but deep breathing, exercising vigorously, dancing. I do a lot of kitchen Alexa dancing, shaking. There's a reason animals shake it off. They shake it off, they process it, they move on. Jumping. You may look like a fool, but it works. All this stuff, it has to come out. So in the last few minutes, to process your emotions, that's what I'm saying. I want to, and this all feeds in here together. I want to talk about this concept of window of tolerance. How many of you, don't read my slide yet. How many of you, first of all, have heard the term? You don't have to know what it means. How many of you have heard it? Those of you chattering in the back. How many of you have heard the term window of tolerance? Okay, thank you. How many of you know what it means? I'm just curious okay, I was just curious because a lot of these terms are becoming used a lot, but they're also used a lot of times in different ways. And it's just interesting to see kind of who knows what. And I also, you can't fact check me if you don't know, so that's good. So this goes back to nervous system regulation. We all have a window where we're regulated, a little window. And it will be impacted by a lot of things, including our history, our biology, our current stressors. So within this little window, we can effectively handle challenges without getting dysregulated. So think of it as your physiological comfort zone. And I hesitated to use that because a lot of times we talk about get out of your comfort zone. And in this case, you kind of need to stay in your comfort zone or figure out how to get back into it. But yeah, so when we're above our window of tolerance, so we're outside it, we're hyper aroused, hyper meaning too much. There, thank you. And we may feel anxious. So this may feel like racing thoughts, jitters, hypervigilance, which we've used that term a lot, but hypervigilance where you're just, what was that? Always on alert. And it's not just about physical things, like you hear a sound and you jump. It's also about comments like, oh, she made eye contact with me. She didn't like what I said, or I heard that sigh. What did they mean by that? So hypervigilance can happen when we're above our window, outside our window of tolerance. Sweating, increased heart rate, dizziness. And then when we're below our window of tolerance, we're hypo, meaning,
Not enough.
okay, thought whoever said the first would just shout it out.
Not, okay.
There we go. Hypo aroused, we may feel depressed. This may feel like numbness, detachment, excessive crying, feelings of worthlessness, fatigue. We may physically move more slowly, feel like you're like, running through mud. And it's been helpful for me to realize these are nervous system states. These are not just feelings. This is not just, and it may be triggered by a situation or an emotion or, but these things live in our bodies. And a lot of times we don't even know, because like we talked about before, we have all this stuff coming at us, and we can find ourselves hyper or hypo aroused out of our window of tolerance without really knowing why. But when we notice our physical symptoms and our sensations, our thoughts that go with these things, then it can help us to regulate them. And we can't just talk ourselves out of them, generally, almost always, almost never. And I've found that when I'm hyper aroused or anxious above my window of tolerance, or when I'm hypo aroused, depressed below my window of tolerance, just recognizing it helps me know what I need to do. Do I need to upregulate or downregulate? And you don't have to remember all these terms. I think we can understand the basic concept of anxious, you're up here, you're on edge, too much energy, depressed, hypo aroused, too little energy. So if I'm above my window, these are some things that I found helpful. This is when I need to focus on, I'm trying to lower my energy. I have too much energy. I'm anxious. I need to soothe my nervous system through things like grounding and stillness, meditation. I need to use my senses a lot of times to come back into that window. I might take a hot bath or a cold shower. Changing your temperature helps reset your nervous system. I might do the 5 things exercise, or I might do the examine one thing closely. I might walk barefoot outside. I try to do that every day, or do some slow movement. So when I'm up here, I need movement, but I don't need that frantic movement. I need slow movement. People who like to do yoga, things like that, soothing. Sometimes I'll take a sensory walk and I'll just pick up a leaf. This is really nice in the fall, like pick up a nice leaf and just kind of hold it, twirl it around, look at it, or a stick or, whatever, and just something to focus physically on. And I'll listen, what do I hear? What do I see? What do I smell? Usually not tasting anything on a walk. Deep breathing, excuse me, deep breathing can help. Breathing can also be triggering for some people. So, it is about learning what works for you. There are all kinds of breathing exercises that, I'll just name a few of them. So, deep breathing, slow breathing slowly in one nostril. It's really hard to do that while I'm talking. In one nostril, out the other. Box breathing, where you try to do an inhale, hold, exhale, hold for the same amount of time. Let me do that for the video. Let's all try that, just a few rounds. So we're going to do like 3 seconds in and then 3 seconds hold. Okay. It's really hard to do that in a group. There's another one called lazy 8 breathing. I'll use this with kids, clients sometimes, where you they need something to focus on. So you're just breathing while you make an 8 or an infinity sign. And you're just kind of following it around. There's one called a physiological sigh, and sometimes you can see animals do this. A lot of times, I think after they've gone through something traumatic, and it's really hard to breathe and explain, but it's a deep breath in, and then before you exhale, it's another quick, short breath, and then an exhale. So it's kind of when you're sobbing, it's what you naturally do. So it's, yeah. That sounded like Lamaze when I did it that time, but and then another one is making your exhale longer than your inhale. So doing, 6 seconds in, 8 seconds out. There's all kinds of breathing things. There's a really cool thing that a lot of you have probably heard, but I'm going to read this. Scholars and rabbis say that the letters YH, WH represent breathing sounds or aspirated consonants. And that's the name Yahweh, obviously. When pronounced without vowels, it sounds like breathing. There's the YH, and it's kind of the inhale, and the WH, exhale. So I have this quote, "A baby's first cry, their first breath, speaks the name of God. A deep sigh, a groan or gasp calls his name, too heavy for mere words. Even atheists speak his name, unaware that the breath in their lungs acknowledges God. Likewise, a person leaves this earth with their last breath when God's name no longer fills their lungs. When we can't utter anything else, is our cry calling out his name? Being alive means we speak his name often. Is it heard the loudest when we're the quietest? In sadness, we breathe heavy sighs. In joy, our lungs feel like they will burst. In fear, we hold our breath and must breathe slowly to help us calm down. When we're about to do something hard, we take a deep breath to find our courage. Breathing gives him praise, even in the most challenging moments. This universal truth is beautiful and should fill us up. God chose to give himself a name that we can't help but speak every moment we're alive." And one thing I thought of the first time I read that, and it kind of makes me cry every time I think about it, but Jesus on the cross, when it specifically, it talks about him breathing his last breath, breathing out the name of his Father. And one of the accounts specifically phrases it like, it says the centurion, when he saw how he breathed his last, believed or was converted. And I think that's just beautiful that Christ breathing out the name of Yahweh was converting in that last breath. Okay, so if I'm below that window of tolerance, more on the depressed side, and I'm using the word depressed, we use that in a lot of different ways. We have people with a diagnosis of clinical depression. We have, I'm just using it simply as an adjective, feeling depressed, a depressed state. This is when I do want to increase movement. And sometimes that's hard when you're feeling depressed. You don't want to move. Again, I'm going to look really silly demonstrating this, but I do a lot of this, rubbing hands together. I do a lot of just kind of feeling the texture of my jeans, tapping, anything bilateral tapping, whether it's eye movement, that's a whole nother thing, but this bilateral sensation, whether it's noises, it's a regulating system all of its own. Yes.
Someone mentioned during Mandy's classes about like prepping stuff for the next generation to come out. And I think one thing that like Jesus tells us to be like little children, and I think that means lots of things. One thing, they do all of these things naturally, and that one breathing style, and it's the double inhale and exhale.
Yeah.
That's what kids do. That's what we all do when we start crying.
Mhm.
And when kids start doing that, we're like, oh, calm down.
Yeah.
That's literally what they're doing, and we're stopping them from doing that.
Yeah.
We intervene,
Mhm.
and that puts our body back into parasympathetic response. We can't interrupt those processes. So
Yeah.
we should just let kids do that kind of thing and learn from them, because they can't help but do it. And we get in our own way when we try to block these processes.
Yeah, really good point. Just to summarize, just talking about kids that naturally will do that. And that is regulating them. And we don't need to tell them to calm down, because that's what they're trying to do. And you also reminded me, I was thinking of some of these bilateral stuff. I was thinking of the little hand slapping games we used to do. We need to bring that back. Let's do that when we're gonna circle out. We're gonna end with a little hand slapping game. Kim.
I'm just gonna say that I used to tell my children, don't sigh at me, you know,
Oh.
and like that was what it was, but what I didn't know is that if I'm dysregulated, then their expressions of processing their emotions when I haven't processed mine makes me feel worse. And
Oh,
so I have to
interesting.
shut down
Yeah.
their emotions because I feel unsafe with their display of it.
Mhm. Yeah, really good point. Again, about kids. Kim was saying if kids are doing some of that natural regulation and you're dysregulated, it can make you feel uncomfortable. And did I say that right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's why you want to stop
Yeah.
their
You want to stop
processing.
them doing that and tell them to calm down and stop crying, or I'll give you something to cry about and all that. That also reminded me of something. Oh, I've noticed with people who are either just crying really heavily or having a panic attack or something. I've only had it happen in front of me a couple times, but I've said just kind of naturally, I've just said, because I know you're not supposed to say like breathe deep and try to like tell them all that. And I'll try to encourage them to just watch how I'm breathing and, just try to kind of subtly breathe with someone else. And I found that can be helpful. Yeah, so rhythmic movement, bilateral tapping, this is when you're hypo aroused, faster exercise. So I'll try to get outside in the sunshine, use bright lights in my house. The last few months I've been super into bright lights, and Janine is currently living in my house and she's even super duper into bright lights. And I've ordered all these string lights and I just am really loving light. I got these really cool lamps and then I just kept ordering more and more of them because they can change the tone and the volume and it's really cool. Amazon. And so this is when I also need to get around people, but you don't always want to talk to people when you're upset, or you're depressed. And it's great to have people that you can say, just let me sit with you, just sit with me. And I remember when I first, a long story, but when I first came to the chapel or first kind of started associating with you all, I am an introvert. I'm social, but I'm an introvert, and the energy could be a lot. And I would hide in the bathroom, and there were certain people that I could just go up to, and I would just very awkwardly embrace the awkwardness and say, just don't talk to me. Just let me stand by you. And they would just kind of regulate me. Becky Opitz is really was my person for that. So sometimes one thing I've done sometimes is I live across the street. There's a CVS and a thrift store and a Dollar Tree, and they're all great places to just go and spend money or not spend money. And a while back, I was just really feeling I was below my window of tolerance and I needed to get a little more energy. And I just went over and I went in all the stores. I didn't take any money with me. I just walked around and I found myself on the greeting card aisle and I just started reading all the cards and cracking myself up. And I don't think I took my phone with me because I remember thinking I really wanted to text pictures of them to people, but I couldn't. And then I went, it seems so silly, but I went over to the medicine aisle and I decided I was going to find all the letters of the alphabet in order on the medicines, because that's the aisle to do it on with all the Excedrin, Q, NyQuil, all that. So I just did that. I just spent a few minutes doing that and I walked back home. I danced with my dog. It was great. Not in the store, but when I got home. So basically waking the nervous system up is what you're trying to do in that case. The change in temperature can help with that too. Hot bath, cold shower, go step outside, put your face up against the glass of your car window while you're driving. Not for too long. Animals, playing piano, just getting active, getting some input. Okay, so I want to leave you with one more exercise. So one thing I do, I'm a behavior analyst and I can't really explain what that means because I just recently changed my whole focus, but I'm now doing a lot of or using a lot of techniques from something called acceptance and commitment therapy with my clients who have developmental disabilities and generally some comorbid pretty severe mental illnesses. And so this exercise I found, and it's part of this acceptance and commitment therapy, which is pronounced ACT if you're going to do the acronym, not ACT. And I like the title, Dropping Anchor, because it reminds me of one of my favorite verses, which is Hebrews 6:19. And I have a nautical room at my house, and I have anchors everywhere. And I have one picture that has this verse. And Valerie came to my house the other day, and I don't think I even commented on it, but she was wearing a shirt with that verse on it. Hebrews 6, verse 19. This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and steadfast, and one which enters within the veil. I'll read the next verse, where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever after, or according to the order of Melchizedek. So our hope in Jesus is our anchor. And so I just like that this talks about anchors. So dropping anchor, it's a 3-step process, and it helps us focus on accepting our reality. And remember, when I say accepting, I know we have a lot of thoughts with that, and we think condoning or we think approving, and that's not what the word actually means. It's just accepting that our reality is our reality. And as comfortable as that may be at times. And then the next step is getting in touch with the present using mindfulness and then taking committed action in the direction of our values. So, and it's convenient because it actually spells out ACT as these 3 steps. So the first step is when you notice a feeling or sensation or thought that you don't enjoy, just acknowledging it. So kind of what we talked about before with naming. So we're noticing and naming. This works great with chronic pain. So, you know, if it's a feeling, I'm feeling sad, or I'm feeling pain in my back, I'm feeling angry. And we're not actively trying to get rid of that. And counterintuitively, what you find is a lot of times you do, even chronic pain can be helped with this. But if you go into it with that as the end result, it's really going to backfire and it's not as helpful. So we're focusing on accepting the reality and then doing something with it. So the second step is just sitting with, or this is part of the first step. We just take a minute and just sit with the thought, the feeling, the sensation, the pain, the fear. And then we want to anchor to the present through our senses. So that can be any of those mindfulness, you know, the 5 things. Sometimes I'll do, again, I just like the texture of jeans just makes it easy to just kind of, you're just like, it's so simple, but you're just connecting to the present. A lot of my clients have difficulty following like receptive instructions. And so I'll try to find something really simple, like, can you do this with me? So, you know, I'll start with, how are you feeling? And whatever you're feeling, we sit with that, and then we're going to connect to our bodies, to the present. So whatever we can do to just kind of anchor us here. And a lot of it is about that safety. We need to feel safe where we are. So we do, or that might be also, something like feeling the texture of things around us, just using our senses. And then finally, we take a committed action in the direction of our values. So our value isn't a goal. Our goal might be to make a new friend. Our value is being a friendly person, being kind. So the fruit of the Spirit, a lot of those are value oriented. So we want to take a step in that direction. So it might be, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling pain. I've done some things to kind of stay in the present, connect with the immediate environment. Now I'm going to choose to get up and go for a walk, get up and call someone. If I value being physically fit, I'm going to go for a walk even though I don't feel like it. I'm going to go write someone a card because I value compassion. So we accept the thought, the feeling, the sensation as our current reality. We anchor ourselves in the present and we take committed action. So I use this a lot when I'm feeling stuck, and it starts to become, just a few seconds is all it takes. And I like that it has spiritual components, including the anchor imagery. So I could talk about this topic forever. And I know many of you in here have similar interests and similar kind of overlapping areas that you could also talk about this forever. And I hope the conversation can continue. And there's so many resources out there. I feel kind of bad that I didn't put more specific resources, but it's hard. People here can share resources better than I can. Kim, Janine.
I can give you one to share. It's
Okay.
really easy and free. It's an app developed by the VA, and it's called PTSD Coach.
PTSD Coach
And when
is
you
an
go
app.
on it, it says, how are you feeling? I'm angry, I'm worried, I'm sad. And then you rate it, I'm really sad. And then it immediately gives you all those things she just told you to do. And then you might be like, I don't like that. And then you go new tool. Okay, oh, I like that. And I'm gonna do that.
Okay,
And then
nice.
it keeps track of everything, like you can look at your history, you can look at how that's gotten better over time, if you wanna look at that.
Yeah. Tonight for those of you who are staying for the hymn sing and dinner, these are good conversations to keep having, or if you're going to the VMFA or doing whatever with the group, keep having these conversations. I know we've just scratched the surface. But in summary, I believe God has given us the ability to participate and co-create in the development of our spiritual soil. We're not helpless victims of our past, but we also don't do it ourselves. We do it through abiding in God and Jesus and letting this work happen within us. We've been given dominion, autonomy, responsibility, and tools for transformation. We have a loving Father who has promised that if we abide in him and in his Son, that we will be with him forever. Our soil can be cultivated at any time. Many of you are familiar with how the land of Israel has enacted many initiatives and invented technologies to turn its barren deserts into beautiful, green, fertile lands. God wants to do this and will do this with our lives as well. So I hope we leave here feeling empowered to help in this process with God and Jesus to cultivate good spiritual soil and bear fruit 30, 60, and 100-fold, and to help support others in their spiritual growth and cultivation as well. So thank you very much. And I asked somebody, who did I ask to? Okay, Lisa, will you come up here, please, and close with prayer? Sure.
Let's bow our heads. Immortal, invisible, all-knowing God, how majestic is your name in all the earth. And we just pray, we thank you for this beautiful day. Our hearts are rejoice in the goodness of this day that you've given us, and this time to come together to learn from your word, to be encouraged by our sisters in the faith. Lord, we thank you for all those who have worked in putting this together, and for those who've come so far, and your hand of protection and guidance over us and bringing us here to this day and to this time. We pray that as we go forward from this place, that you will be with us, that you will guide us and direct us, that you will help us to lay down in green pastures and lead us beside the still waters, that you will keep us in perfect peace because our minds are stayed on thee. Lord, and may we long to abide in your courts, in your holy place, for we know that one day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. Be with us this day and bring us back safely this evening. In Jesus' precious and holy name we pray. Amen.
You don't need this to be zoomed, right? Okay. Bye, everyone on Zoom.